Well, let's put aside, at least for a while, discussions of Jesus' nature. There are discussions about the Trinity that continue on, but that pretty well settles it for a while, and it's not until we get later on in history where some of these controversies come up again. Not the same kind of controversies, but over the nature of Jesus. An additional development in doctrine in the early Middle Ages was the development of the papacy. Now, a lot of what we're talking about has some precedence in the 4th century, and so we're kind of, seeing how this is consolidating power in the person of the Bishop of Rome. Right? So there's antecedents in the 4th century as Constantine becomes emperor, as the empire gradually becomes Christianized. There are a couple of strands of development, historical development, that are connected here. One is debate over the role of Peter in the New Testament. And of course, there are questions about what Peter's role is that develop. Was he the leader of the apostles? He seems to take a prominent role in Acts early on. And of course, he's the one that confesses that Jesus is the Christ in Caesarea Philippi, Matthew 16. And Jesus tells him, I'm going to give you the keys of the kingdom. Right? And then there's that question of when Jesus says, upon this rock I will build my church. What rock does he mean? Does he mean rock Peter, Petros, Kepha, or is he talking about Peter's confession? Furthermore, of course, Peter's tied with Rome. 1 Peter is written from Rome, and he talks about being an elder or a bishop in Rome. And so people will say, well, he was a bishop in Rome. And so, with this notion of apostolic tradition and apostolic succession, a church that was tied to Peter would be pretty significant, right, because of Peter's activity. Additionally, of course, Paul is connected to Rome as well. So there's not just one apostle Rome's connected to, it's connected to two. Another development in here, of course, is the monarchical episcopate. Right, that one bishop model, where that one bishop bears the most responsibility, especially in the fight against heretics. And of course, there are so many things that we talked about before about how and why does this develop. Traveling apostles eventually settled down. They probably would have been given prominence, and maybe successors would have then been chosen. Third strand in this, we've already kind of touched on, Matthew 16:18. Now Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage that we talked about earlier, says that in 16:18 we also have to understand 18:18, where Jesus talks about giving the keys to, or giving the authority to all of the apostles. And so Cyprian says Jesus gave the keys to all the bishops. Right? So it's not centralized in Rome, it's to all the bishops. That it's the bishops. Right? That there's something particular about the bishops. Origen, however, said that the word of Matthew 16:18 is spoken to all Christians. Faith is the foundation, not Peter. And for once I'd have to say to Origen, I agree with you. All right? Not much I agree with Origen about, but I think that's absolutely right. It's that confession of Jesus' nature. Right, as the Son of God, the Messiah. But the mainstream church followed Cyprian, that in Matthew 16:18, Jesus was giving authority to the bishops. Furthermore, right, so we got all this historical development. Questions about Peter, Matthew 16:18, the development of the bishopric. Rome gradually began to become more important religiously. We talked about the question of lapsed Christians and how it's the Bishop of Rome that kind of steps in there to kind of try and solve this. Rome also began to emphasize the importance of unity, particularly unity with Rome, right? And so it tries to encourage other bishops to follow its guide. But there's also that political side. Rome was powerful politically, especially after Constantine. And so Constantine's rule had kind of encouraged centralization. And so, politically, and so that develops religiously as well. But don't forget, of course, Constantine moves his capital to Constantinople, and so Rome decreases in political power and Constantinople increases. And so the Council of Constantinople declared that Constantinople was the new Rome, and that it is second only to Rome religiously. Ultimately, they argued that the rank of a bishop is based on a city's rank. So how prominent the city was indicated how prominent the bishop was. The bishops of Rome, though, gradually became more and more emphatic about the need for everyone to be centralized around the bishop of Rome's authority. Lots of opposition, especially from the east. And especially after the invasions, the Bishop of Rome, became the figurehead of the guardian of civilization. Right? He's the bright Roman Western light, and a focal point for unity as other churches in the West rallied around him. One of the first to make some of these grand claims was the Bishop of Rome that we talked about briefly before, Leo I. He attempts to make some of these claims, but they're not immediately accepted. People disagree with his claims. He negotiates with Attila the Hun and the Vandals, bringing peace to Rome, and so that raises his prominence as well. One of the other things Leo argued was, well, Peter was the successor of Christ, or the vicar of Christ, the representative. The Bishop of Rome was Peter's direct successor. So, by apostolic succession, the Bishop of Rome is the vicar, the representative of Christ. Now again, you have to accept some of those premises at the beginning to accept the conclusion. We could argue about what Peter really was. And so he kind of starts the ball rolling of this language of succession of Peter being the representative of Christ. The Eastern Church, however, does not uphold these views. The Patriarch of Constantinople gradually became referred to as the Universal Patriarch, and claimed that Peter had also been a bishop in Alexandria and Antioch. And with its rise in political prominence, Constantinople had taken over the privileges and prerogatives of Rome. And so those happened politically, so why should they not happen religiously as well? Furthermore, and this is a rather interesting argument, Peter had been brought to the Lord by who? Who brought Peter to the Lord? Who brought Peter to Jesus? His brother. What's his brother's name? Andrew. Right? So the tradition was that Andrew had founded the church at Byzantium, which was, in the early Middle Ages, Constantinople. And so since Andrew had founded Constantinople, Constantinople should be higher than Rome, because Andrew had been a follower of Jesus first, and it helped Peter become a follower of Jesus. Even though you might say, I don't think that really. It is kind of an interesting rationalization that somebody throws out there. The first real pope, the first bishop of Rome to really exercise the power we think of when we talk about the pope, was a man named Gregory I. He had been a Roman official, so he'd been involved in the government. He was a religious ambassador, and ultimately had turned to monasticism before being elected pope. several different things that are interesting here. He negotiates with the Lombards, which is a Frankish tribe, right? Not a Germanic tribe, it's a Frankish tribe, so where modern-day France is. And essentially, he negotiates with them as ruler of Rome. And so, he kind of sets himself up that way. He also promoted the idea and made it the church teaching of clerical celibacy, right? That priests and bishops cannot get married or have sex. The same with nuns as well. He's also the one who developed the Gregorian chant. He's the one that really promotes the idea of purgatory, right? This kind of realm between heaven and hell. So if you're not bad enough to go to hell, you're not good enough to go to heaven, you end up in purgatory until you have worked off your sin. Now, Augustine had kind of suggested that idea, but Gregory is the one who really takes it forward. After Gregory, emperors in Constantinople attempted to assert their authority over Rome, just as they asserted their authority over the eastern part of the empire. And so the popes turned to the Franks for support, the Frankish tribes, not like Huttons. So they turned to the Franks for support, since they are losing support from the emperor. What questions do you have?
I have one. Gregory the First was the first pope. Who voted for him? Did they already have the College of Cardinals, or what?
It was kind of like it wasn't. It was the bishops, right? There isn't quite the College of Cardinals that will become, but it's the bishops of the West that kind of. So eventually they'll be.
So did they go into conclave like they do still today?
No, there's still not that quite of. The conclave idea kind of develops within the Middle Ages due to some people get in the papacy that bought it. We're immoral people, and so eventually that kind of develops into this. We have to have a very good procedure to say who the head of the Catholic Church is. Okay. Other questions? All right, let's move on into practice and talk about some developments within practice. One of the big things that happens in this period, the early Middle Ages, is some changes with monasticism. In the East, monasticism kind of reached its apex around 400, right? So just at the turn of the 4th and 5th century. There were still some in the East who often lived these very extreme lifestyles as monks, thinking that was, an expression of their piety, of their righteousness. The Boscoi were a group of monks who grazed like cattle. So if you feel the need to get closer to God, hit the lawn, eat grass like cattle. There were the Dendrites who lived in trees, and thought living in trees was a way to be more holy. People wore chains, like we talked about before. And then there was Simeon Stavridis. He built this pillar that eventually reached like 60 feet high. And he sat on top of it. According to some traditions, for more than 30 years. They would kind of bring up the food by ropes. Evidently, he would stand motionless all night. He would be up there on the pole, touching his forehead with his feet. How does that? So, these are the extremes.
The original yoga.
Yeah. Now, yoga, maybe there is an influence here, but from India. Yoga would have been much more earlier than this. So maybe that's it's reached the Middle East by this time. And some of these people, it's just some very, very strange things that they taught. I understand that going off by yourself, focusing on spiritual, and so you fast and some other things. But then, some of these extremes, how do you justify that as, this is helping you spiritually to stand on a pole for 30 years. Ultimately, communal monasteries developed to kind of counteract these extremes. What's also interesting is that in these Christological controversies, the Eastern monasteries usually ended up on the side of the heretics. It's almost like you could have a scorecard of who's the monastics side with. Oh, that's the heretical one, right? This easy way to tell the heresies is this the monastics are supporting, except for Mary. Mary was a very, very important person of devotion for the monastics, especially in the West, also in the East. In the West, however, there's a little bit different type of development. And monasticism kind of pops up in a couple of different centers, mainly as people are fleeing from the Vandals, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the regular Goths, the extra strength Goths. No, that last one wasn't real. So they're kind of fleeing, and so as they're fleeing, they develop communities kind of where they are. We talked about how in the East they eventually developed these kind of rules for living for these communities, like Basil of Caesarea creates the rule. In the West, Benedict of Nursia is the first one to lay out a rule for communal living called the Benedictine Rule. Inside of, just a couple of aspects of this. Inside the walls of the monastery, the monks were responsible for providing all communal necessities. Right? So growing their own food, making their own clothes. The early Benedictine monks focused on those inside the monastery. Now they would provide hospitality, but a lot of the focus was on inside. The monk's day was broken up around hours of prayer, known as the divine office. And so at different times during the day, you would stop what you were doing and you would pray. There would be times of meditatively reading Scripture or engaged in manual labor. After Benedict's death, the greatest promoter of his approach was Gregory I. So he's the one that really champions the Benedictine rule.